I live on Cape Cod, where we have a thing we call a Cape Cod lawn. It's not that beautiful, neatly trimmed, expansive fescue with no clover or dandelions that's so prized in so many suburbs and required in others. A Cape Cod lawn is whatever happens to grow in your front yard, in a often barren and sandy soil. When we moved to Cape Cod a dozen years ago, our front lawn was a Cape Cod lawn. But our backyard wasn't as good as the Cape Cod lawn. There were a few little patches of grass, but it was mostly either barren or worse, there were huge sections that were so overgrown you could not see the 6-foot-high fence. Our 1-foot little West Highland Terriers were not pleased. My wife was less pleased, so I set out to tackle it. I tore out all the overgrowth, I rototilled, I seeded it, I fertilized it, I watered it. And now our backyard is green. It is fescue, but it's got a bunch of other things in it, clover and dandelions and things I cannot recognize. And then one fine spring day, there was a knock on the door. I was at my office. My wife was home. She answered. The man knocking had a yard care service. He introduced himself as the weed man. The weeds that grow in your yard, those kind. You people, I don't know. I get to get into this congregation better. Anyway, he started with a sales pitch, but my wife interrupted and said, "My husband handles the yard work. Call later," because she was much too kind to say, "We don't want your help." So he called me, and the conversation went something like this. "Hello, this is the weed man. I am here to pour chemicals all over your weeds and make your yard a beautiful growth of fescue." Well, I said, "Who is it that decides what is a weed?" He said, "Anything that's not fescue is a weed." I said, "But I like clover. You know, it kind of breaks up the green with this beautiful white color, and it's really good for bees. And I also really, really like dandelions. You know, dandelions are really beautiful, and they're tuberous, and they break up the soil, and some people will use the leaves for food. And are you familiar with the concept of biodiversity?" Well, there was a long pause. And he said, but I'm the weed man. What are you going to do about your weeds?" And I said, "I have learned to love them." He's not called back since. The reason I tell that story is I think it's very easy to think of ourselves as being the fescue and other people being the weeds. If it doesn't look like fescue, it needs to be gone. And it troubles me in church and in faith practices, a practice that divides us instead of unites us, a practice that tries to remove others as though they were the weeds. Our faith in Jesus and our commitment to follow the way of Jesus should be what always unites us, but often it does not. Now, my wife is not here to defend herself, but I'm telling a story on her. A number of years ago, my wife caused an ecumenical incident at a church in New Hampshire. You'll meet her, you'll understand. What had happened was one of the teachers at the school had died, and there was a funeral, and my wife was at the funeral, and when it came time for people to come up front for the communion or the Eucharist, my wife walked up with everybody else. And when she got all the way up front, the priest holding the plate with a wafer said to her, "You're not Catholic, are you?" She said, "Nope," grabbed the wafer and ran. I will tell her of your applause. There is an intolerance in the faith and practice of others that essentially says, you can worship God in your way, we will worship God in God's way. It was expressed in that verse by Jonathan Swift, who wrote, "We are God's chosen few, all others will be damned. There is no place in heaven for you, we can't have heaven crammed." It's countered by the words of Edward Markham, who wrote, "I drew a circle, he drew a circle, he drew a circle that shut me out, rebel, heretic, thing to flout, but love and I had wit to win. We drew a circle that took him in." The disciples tried to draw a circle to keep out that other exorcist. He was just a weed. But Jesus redrew the circle to include him in. This is Jesus who touched lepers, who ate with tax collectors and sinners. Jesus who took little children in his arms, drew wide the circle. He pitched a big tent. The disciples, though, wanted just a tent that would fit just them. They wanted a tent only for their kind. And it seems that what the disciples were upset about is that the man was not following them. If you listen carefully as this was read, it did not say, "He was not following you, Jesus." They said, "He was not following us." They didn't seem to understand that the real healing power doesn't come from us, it always comes from God. And we are simply the agents of God in healing. There is an ecumenical affirmation that says, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, charity. In non-essentials, liberty. In all things, charity. God is not to be bound, and God's work is not to be limited by some official channels. Bidden or unbidden, the seeds of the Spirit fly about us and grow. God is free to do as God's will. We cannot manipulate where God works or how God works. And that's why it is important there is such a rich diversity that is embraced. Casting out demons, proclaiming God's word, giving a cup of water to a parched person is not something bequeathed to just a few of God's people. Works done in God's name cannot be limited by church bureaucracies or church councils or ordination councils or clergy. God gives to those to whom God chooses to give. Let me use an example. In this building, I understand we have Narcotics Anonymous groups that meet. These are self-led groups run by the members. No one in that group is required to have any degree or any certification. The only qualifications for leadership are a significant period of sobriety and a willingness to lead. But why do these groups always seem to meet in churches? Why not in libraries or community agencies or hospitals? See if you could follow this trail. Narcotics Anonymous came out of Alcoholics Anonymous. A century ago, Alcoholics Anonymous came out of Moral Recovery and the Oxford Group. And before that, it came out of the Anglican Church. And before that, it came out of the mouth of Jesus. And that's why, in most recovery groups, people say the Lord's Prayer, and why they often say the Serenity Prayer, a prayer that was first offered by the Reverend Dr. Reinhold Niebuhr, an evangelical and reformed scholar, one of the two groups that formed the United Church of Christ, a prayer he never offered at an AA meeting. He simply offered that one Sunday in Heath, Massachusetts, when he was preaching. So there's this direct line from the gospel all the way up to the recovery groups. And it is at such meetings in churches that I have seen lives simply transformed, not by people with credentials, but people willing to share the healing ministry of God. It reminds me of a story of a man who had wasted many of his paychecks in a local pub. And one day grace struck, and he became sober, and he quit drinking, and he started going to church. And one of his old drinking buddies came up to see him, and he said, "Do you really believe that thing about Jesus? turning water into wine. Man said, well, I don't know about that, but I know that for me, he turned beer into furniture. Jesus said if they're not against us, they're for us. They're for the gospel ministry of helping people who are wrestling with whatever demons bother them. And I know that this community is rich with faith groups, with agencies, with individuals becoming allies with us in the healing ministry. So this is really a great lesson about the value of inclusion, but there's also a warning about not including others, about excluding others, about damaging others. The three things that Jesus mentioned, the hand, the eye, and the foot, represent three common ways we're tempted by what we see, what we touch, and where we can go. And sometimes, as Jesus said, there are things we have to cut off. He used the hyperbole about plucking out eyes and cutting off hands and legs. It's sort of like how we say something's going to cost an arm and a leg. But there are things we have to cut off, things like anger and envy, lust and greed. Or there's a saying in AA that if you want to change yourself, if you want to be changed, you're going to need new playthings, new playgrounds, and new playmates. Sometimes there are things in our life that just have to be amputated. And a person causing another on their faith journey to stumble will suffer a terrible fate at God's hands, even more terrible than being thrown violently into the sea and drowned. And the word Jesus used for hell referred to a garbage dump outside of Jerusalem that was always burning. It's a way of saying, if you do that to people, your life will become garbage. So Jesus gave a lesson on inclusion, a warning about the dangers of exclusion, and a promise that may have seemed very odd about salt and fire. And since this place refers to it or has referred to itself as the Salt City, you should know that in biblical times, both salt and fire were used not just for the preservation of food, but they were also used in temple worship. Temple sacrifice could involve both fire and salt. Salt is identified with keeping things fresh, keeping things viable, and so it's a symbol of the eternal, unwavering steadiness of God, of God's covenant with Israel. The promise that God made with Israel was a covenant of salt, a covenant that will never soil. And so this sacrifice at the temple was both salted and burned, demonstrating the eternal nature of God's promise. Well, some, of course, will still decide that they can decide what's a weed and what is not a weed. They try to judge others who is the true follower, but those are really judgments that belong to God alone. I like the story of an old farmer who had been working in the soil for many, many years. And one day there was an evangelist who came to town, and the evangelist asked him what denomination the man belonged to. So the old farmer answered it like this. He said, when my grain is ready to be harvested, I harvest it, I package it, I take it into town, and I go by one of three roads, either the river road or the dirt road or the highway. When I get my grain to town and I go to the man to sell it, he never asks me what road I took to get here. He only asks me if the grain is any good. Whatever road people take is not ours to judge. Instead, we should be putting up a big tent like Jesus did, opening the way, giving an extravagant welcome. However we get here, however we do the work of God's love and mercy and healing, we should be Christ to others and widely welcome all. Amen.